painting here and here. Now today I want to paint a demo for you, a complete painting, and it's going to be all about the sky. Now I'm going to be sharing some of the techniques in painting the sky and painting this particular painting that we haven't gotten to yet on our Patreon page. But I just want you to watch how I would go about painting a typical beautiful cloudy sky with blue. The blue sky, happy, I call it a happy sky. In fact, let me just show you the painting, and I'll hold it here so that you can get a chance to look at it. And it's one of those skies where it's blue sky, but clouds are moving in or moving out. I don't really quite remember. It doesn't really matter. I just know that the clouds are very beautiful. I just love the way they are so kind of ethereal in the sky. And that's pretty much what I want to capture in this painting. So I'm working on a piece of, it's 9 by 12, piece of Wallace Belgian Mist, Warm Mist it's called, and I got it last year when Kitty Wallace was selling them as seconds. Now I'm not sure that they're still available, but I got about 100 pieces, so I'm really enjoying using these until they're gone, and then I won't be sad because they're gone. But I like it because it's a nice kind of neutral, warm tone, and I won't have to do really any kind of underpainting, which is really, really nice because I just want to get right into painting this sky, and I don't want to think about how am I going to start the painting. Am I going to do wet? Am I going to rub it in? In this case, I'm going to just paint directly onto this neutral tone. By the way, you can get a neutral tone on your own if you simply tone the paper using thin paint or using pastel and rubbing it in. In fact, the month of July we're going to be devoting our study to papers, supplies, toning paper, types of paper, and anything paper and pastel related. So that'll be good to plan on staying with me till July because we got a lot more coming. So the first thing I'm going to do is simply, it's about the sky, so I'm going to have a much lower horizon. I'm not really worried about what's going on in on the ground. It just is some kind of distant mountain shapes, and there's some kind of scruffy bushes or bushes or trees down in here. So I'm using a pencil just to kind of sketch in. But again, this painting is not about the ground, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. It's going to be just a matter of a collection of shapes. In fact, what I'm going to do is, before I even start the sky, go ahead and block in the stuff on the ground. That way I can understand or know what colors and shapes are on the ground, and that way I can relate the things that are happening in the sky to what's on the ground. So here I'm using a dark burgundy pastel to block in the darks. There's some dark kind of scruffy trees, so I'm using a darker kind of mossy green. Now notice I'm not paying too much attention to what's going on the ground, because remember, it's not about the ground. Now there was some I think it was probably aspen trees past their prime, if I really want to get technical about what was in my scene. So I'm just going to suggest them, not really want to spend too much time. And then there was some distant mountain shapes, and I think I'm going to use some, that might not be, let's make them a little bit darker. So I've got that beautiful distant, I call this the distant mountain blue, so that I can get those mountain shapes to look like they're going way in the back, in the distance. Now you'll notice in my photo, when you look at the photo where I'll post it in on our page, that I made the distant mountain a lot darker, or excuse me, I made it a lot lighter. It's a lot darker in the photo, but I really wanted to not have it quite as dark. I might adjust it at some point, but for now I think it's a good start. Now I want to paint the clouds in the sky. So there's a couple things I have to keep in mind. The sky is blue, and it's going to change from darkest and deepest blue at the zenith, or the top of my painting, and it gets gradually lighter and cooler as I go towards the horizon. And actually I think, now that I'm thinking about it, just because for this painting I really did want the sky to be the star, I am going to go ahead and darken that mountain. I like that color for a mountain shape, but it's not going to allow my sky to feel like it's filled with light. And, you know, this is just an example that you should kind of keep in mind, that the first thing that you do in a painting doesn't mean you can't change it. I mean, just because I made it blue doesn't mean it has to stay blue if I feel like it needs to change. So I'm going to actually go right down the middle now that I have darkened it and just use a duller blue. And that is the best of both worlds. So now I can move on to the sky. So I asked myself, I've got some big clouds and I've got some thinner clouds. So I know that the larger clouds I want to leave room for because I want them to feel bright. So I'm going to just take a very pale blue Nupastel and kind of sketch in some of those larger clouds. Now here's one thing when I paint the sky that I like to do. I like to arrange my cloud shapes so that they make a more interesting design or painting. In other words, I don't just look at the photo, which is really to me just a moment captured in time, and say, okay, this is exactly how I have to paint them. I want to make them arranged so that they are in a much more interesting arrangement. So I will never grid a sky so where I'm exactly copying exactly what's in the photo. I'll use the photo for an example of the type of clouds they were and maybe how, what colors I see and that kind of thing, and maybe general shape, but I'll never copy them exactly. So the next thing I'm going to do is actually go ahead and put in the sky behind the cloud shapes. And I'm going to start off with a darker color than I really want it to be, or value of blue. And I'm going to pull that darker blue a little bit further down than I want it to go. And I know that as I go down lower into the sky, it gets a little bit warmer. So instead of the cool blue that I just picked up, I'm actually using a more turquoise blue or a warmer blue. And as the sky goes even lower, I'm going to get it to be a little bit lighter. Now this to me is still too dark. So I need to go in with a little bit of a lighter blue just to give it a little bit more, just to lighten it, just a touch. Then I'm going to continue. Now here's one thing, when you're painting a sky that has clouds, you have to take into consideration how the sky changes behind the clouds. So it's a little bit of kind of extra thinking on your part, like when you think to yourself, well, what's going to happen behind those cloud shapes? And you want to be consistent with that, even behind those cloud shapes. Now notice I don't have to do too much as far as blending in the sky color, because the fact that of the warm tone of the paper really kind of allows those colors, where the tone is peeking through, it actually acts as a nice unifying feature. So where you see that little bit of warm brown here and here, it kind of pulls the sky together. So I'm not going to be real quick to try to get rid of that. I really like in this sky, one of the things I really liked is how really nice and warm and light it was all the way to the horizon. So I'm using this really pale turquoisey blue-green. Oh, I don't want that. That is a little bit too pink for that sky, and I'm going to talk about that in just a second. I really need to have, I'm going to bend over, I need to get to my skybox, and I'm going to talk about skybox on one of our Patreon posts. But when I'm painting a blue sky, I like to have a collection of blue that will work for a beautiful typical blue sky. I call it the skybox, and that way I have them all handy and I can use them because I know they're going to work for our typical blue sky. So there we have a nicely layered blue sky behind the clouds. Now let's move on and work on the clouds. So the first thing I want to do when I'm painting the clouds is to decide where the light is coming from, because then I can determine where the shadows are going to be in the cloud. So I'm going to put a little yellow mark up here and say that the sun is coming from here, so that the shadows are going to be underneath and off to the left of the cloud. So I'm going to start by putting in the shadow. And the first thing I'm going to do is that, because I have this color in my hand, how convenient, I'm actually going to throw some of this yellow at the base of these clouds. Now you're probably thinking, yellow? Why are you putting yellow in your cloud in the shadow part of your cloud? Well, the reason why is I don't want to just make my cloud shadows gray, meaning the gray that we find in our pastel sets that have gray and white. To me, that's ashy, it's not as beautiful, and I want to make my own gray. So I'm going to mix 3 colors or more together until they start to neutralize themselves or gray themselves out. Now, what happens when you mix yellow and purple together? You're mixing complements. What happens when you mix complements? I'm giving you a minute to think of the answer. You can see what's happening. The answer is when you mix yellow and purple together, you get a grayed down or neutralized color because you're mixing complements, and when you mix complements or layer complements, they neutralize or turn gray. Now I'm going to add a little bit of green on top of there. And you're probably thinking, green? Why are you using green? Why aren't you using gray? Because these are the shadows. I'm using green because I'm trying to enhance that feeling of gray without using gray. And any time, again, that I can mix more than 3 colors together, it's going to neutralize. What happens when colors neutralize and you don't want them to neutralize, we call that mud. But this time we kind of want mud. I call this Technicolor grays, and I'm going to be talking about this in more detail in a coming video. So I think that's probably sufficient. Let's just go with 1 more layer. We can get a little bit darker. Actually, when I'm looking at the photo, because I will occasionally look at the photo for an idea, I see that there's this kind of a little bit of dark, much darker than I have it, because I think this was either a storm was coming up or a storm was clearing, and so we got this kind of grayed down steel blue happening in some of our clouds. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in right now. And again, that was the influence of looking at my photograph. And I'll blend that in by adding a little bit more of that yellow on top. Alright, now it's time to paint the light on the cloud. So where's the cloud getting light? The light is coming in from the right. So we're going to illuminate the clouds, and before we go to white, which we think, oh, clouds, okay, where it's getting light, it should be white. I'm going to actually go ahead and put that yellow up in there. Now I'll put the yellow in there just so that we can have something for the light to kind of play with. Now I'm going to add a very pale yellow. This is not white. Again, I very rarely will use white when I'm painting the sky or clouds or snow or sand, because I prefer to use pastels of a light value, pale color. So you can see that's much more beautiful and natural feeling than if I just used a pure white. Now there's bits of the cloud that's sticking out and away from the shadow, so I'm going to go ahead with my light pastel while it's in my hand so that I can have a little bit of variety. A little bit over here too. And one thing that happens with clouds is the biggest, brightest, puffiest clouds, if you will, are directly overhead, which would be the top of your painting. And as you go down to the horizon, they tend to get smaller, and then they tend to stack up a little bit so that sometimes they look like they're right on top of one another. And so I'm going to go ahead and use this color to make some smaller little bits of clouds where they get where they go towards the horizon. And what this does, I'm going to make them a little more colorful, so I'm going to add a little bit of peach to them. But what this does is helps give aerial perspective to our sky so that we can feel like the sky is a lot larger than if we just put all the clouds the same exact shape and size. So now what I want to do to kind of bring this sky to a conclusion, if you will, is I need to determine where the edges are. Now I am going to take one last step just so that you can see, and I'm going to add a pure white in just a few key areas, and only up at these top, the clouds that are up at the top of the sky. And sometimes I'll reserve that pure white as an accent. Now where you want to have thin clouds, like the wispy bits that are breaking off, you'll just use a light touch, because that way you can see the sky underneath. But where you want to be able to see the edges of the cloud, in other words, where the cloud, where you can actually see the harder edges of the cloud. And I really encourage you to get outside and really look, when you're looking at the sky, look at the clouds and ask yourself, where are those hard edges? Where can I actually see the edge of the cloud? And where does it just disappear into the sky? And to create that illusion in your painting, you're going to take your sky color and kind of paint backwards and carve into your cloud shape to kind of refine those edges. One of the things that you might want to do is if you really want your clouds to pop and you feel like they're not popping, you might need to blend the sky a little bit more. And so in the case where I want to blend, I'm going to just take a hard pastel and go over those softer layers. And what this does is it kind of knits those softer layers together and kind of smooths out the sky just a little bit more. I'm just going to go all the way down, and then again it gets much lighter as we go to the horizon, so I'm going to just go and refine that. The last thing I'm going to do is just kind of go and give a little bit more of a feeling of light to some of these treetops. So I'm going to take a brighter, lighter yellow value and just hit some of those treetops with some of that, just so that there's a little more interest going on the ground. But basically that's how I do clouds. I just play with them, I just let them develop, and I let them dictate where they need to go in the painting, and I don't get caught up in copying them from the photo, because that's going to lead you into trouble. So have fun, play with clouds. I think Bob Ross said it best, clouds are free, and you won't want to contain them, just have fun with them. So I hope you've enjoyed these tips.